They harvested worlds. We broke down in the middle of one and didn't die. The car stopped making sense 3 blocks before it died. Marcus noticed it first. A stutter in the acceleration, a wrongness in the engine note that sat somewhere between a cough and a held breath. Dia was asleep in the passenger seat, her head tipped against the window, one earbud in, the other dangling across her shoulder. The city outside was dark in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. It was 9:15 in the evening, and the streetlights on Gratio Avenue were out in both directions as far as he could see, which was not very far because the fog had come in off the river and thickened in the low places between buildings like something deliberate. Hey, Marcus said. Dia didn't wake. She was good at sleeping in moving vehicles. She'd told him once that it was a skill she'd developed as a kid, riding buses across the east side to visit her grandmother, and that she'd never quite lost the ability to shut everything out when the wheels were turning underneath her. The wheels stopped turning. The engine gave one last convulsive shudder and went quiet. The dashboard lights dimmed, flickered, died. Even the radio cut out mid-sentence. Some late-night host talking about atmospheric anomalies being reported across the Great Lakes region, unusual readings at the meteorological stations, nothing to worry about, probably just the weather. And then there was no voice, no music, no hum of any kind from the vents. Just the tick of cooling metal and Dia's quiet breathing. Hey, Marcus said again louder. She opened her eyes. She looked at the dark dashboard, then out the window at the dark street, then at him. We stopped, she said. Yeah. She sat up and pulled out the remaining earbud. She coiled the wire around her fingers without looking at it, a habit. What happened? I don't know. She just quit. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Not even the starter clicking. The car was as dead as if there had never been a battery in it. She's been acting weird since we crossed into this stretch. Like something was interfering. It's a 2024 Stellaro. It doesn't just quit. I know. Dia looked out the passenger window. The street they'd stopped on was called something on the map. He couldn't remember what. But it was a residential block that had gone to warehouses. Sometime in the past decade, and the warehouses had half-gone to something else. To vacancy and slow structural collapse. To vines growing up through shattered skylights and loading dock doors pulled down by rust. The buildings were dark. There were no other cars. There was no movement of any kind. I'll call, she said, and reached for her phone. He watched her face change. The phone had power, he could see the glow, but her expression shifted in the way it did when something was working wrong. She held the screen up. No signal. Not one bar. Not even an emergency network indicator. Mine either, Marcus said. He'd already checked. They sat with that for a moment. Okay, Dia said. She said it the way she said it when she was recalibrating, when she was setting aside the first plan and looking for the second one. It was one of the things he loved most about her. She never spent more than 2 seconds being alarmed before she started being practical. How far are we from anything? 3 miles, maybe 4, to the bridge. Less to the old market district, but I don't know if anything's still operating down there. He paused. There were lights maybe a mile back. We could walk back. We could. Neither of them moved. The fog was doing something outside the windows. It wasn't moving the way fog should, drifting, thin, responsive to what little wind there was. It was sitting. It was sitting with the patience of something that had decided to be somewhere, and was not going to be moved by anything as minor as air pressure. It was the same color as the streetlight above them would have been, if the streetlight had been working, a yellowish gray, and in it Marcus could see, or thought he could see, shapes that were probably just buildings, just the dark geometry of abandoned structures, nothing more than that. You're staring, Dia said. I'm looking. There's a difference. There might not be tonight. She followed his gaze. They were both quiet for a moment, then she said, I don't want to walk through that. Neither do I. But we can't stay in the car. No. The reason they couldn't stay in the car arrived at the same moment they both thought it. The car was not going to protect them from anything. It was a shell of composite and glass with no engine heat, no locks that would hold against a determined effort, and the neighborhood they were in was not the kind of neighborhood where sitting in a dead car at 9:30 in the evening was a strategy. That had nothing to do with the fog or the missing streetlights. That was just the math of where they were. Marcus popped the trunk release with the mechanical override and got out. The air hit him immediately. Not cold, not warm, just strange. There was a smell he couldn't identify. Not chemical, not organic, not the usual Detroit mix of river and exhaust and old concrete. Something else. Something that made the back of his neck feel the way it felt in the moment before a close lightning strike. That prickle of potential, of charge. He went to the trunk. In the back, behind the emergency kit and the jumper cables that had never been used, was the tire iron he'd carried in every car he'd owned since he was 19 years old, when his uncle had told him that you were never in a position you couldn't improve with the right tool in your hand. His uncle had been talking about something else entirely, about a job situation, about negotiating from strength, but Marcus had taken it literally and the habit had stuck. He took the tire iron out. He felt immediately better. Dia was beside him. She had her own idea. The road flare from the emergency kit, an extendable baton she kept in the side pocket of her bag that she'd never had to use, and the knowledge that she'd grown up on streets that looked exactly like this one, and had learned before she was 12 which way to run, and when to hold ground and how to read a space by watching its edges. Stay close, she said. You took the words. They closed the trunk. They locked the car out of habit, even though neither of them believed it would matter. They turned and looked at the street. The fog was closer than it had been when Marcus got out of the car. He was certain of that. He had been outside for less than 2 minutes, and the visible edge of it had moved, not by much, but measurably, from the far side of the intersection ahead of them to the near side, from 60 yards to 30. He could no longer see the stoplight that should have been hanging over that intersection. He could no longer see the corner building that should have been on the far right. It's moving, Diaz said. Fog moves. Not like that. She was right, not like that. They watched it for another 3 seconds, and Marcus felt the charge in the air deepen, felt it settle into his teeth and his fingertips, and then a sound came from somewhere inside the fog. Not from the buildings, not from above, not from below, but from inside the fog itself, from the murk and the density of it, and the sound was nothing he could describe. It was below hearing and above it simultaneously. It was the kind of sound that made the body understand something before the mind could process what the body was reacting to. Dia's hand found his arm. Her grip was tight. Back to the car, Marcus said. They went back to the car and got in and closed the doors, and Marcus put his hand on the door lock, even though he knew it wouldn't matter. The fog reached the car 12 seconds after they got inside. It pressed against the windows like a living thing. Not pressed, draped. It draped itself over the vehicle with a quality of exploration, of interest. And in it they could see, not imaginary shapes now, not the geometric ghosts of buildings, forms, moving forms. Things that walked on more legs than legs were supposed to go on, or perhaps fewer legs than walking required, moving in ways that were smooth and deliberate and deeply, fundamentally wrong in the way of a word in a familiar language that has been pronounced slightly incorrectly and cannot be mistaken for the correct word no matter how hard you try. What? Dia said. Not a question, an utterance. Marcus pressed himself back in the driver's seat. He was gripping the tire iron hard enough that he could feel his own pulse in his palm. He watched one of the shapes pass within 5 feet of Dia's window. It was taller than a human being. Its movement suggested a number of joints that human joints did not accommodate. In the yellow-gray fog, it was a silhouette mostly, but there were details, a flatness to the upper body, a width across what should have been shoulders that spoke of different musculature, different architecture, and there was a sound it made as it moved, a low, wet clicking that had no place in the sonic vocabulary of any creature he had ever encountered. It passed. Another came. Another. They were moving in a direction, northeast, Marcus thought, toward the river, and they were moving with purpose, with the organized forward momentum of something that knew where it was going and was going there together. He counted 7 shapes before the fog thickened again and swallowed them. There might have been more. Marcus, Dia said quietly. I see it. What is it? He had no answer. He had grown up in this city. He had lived here his entire 32 years. He knew every neighborhood, every abandoned lot, every stretch of street that had been reclaimed and every stretch that hadn't. He knew the city's sounds, its smells, its moods. He had never in his life felt the way he felt right now, which was the way he imagined a deer felt in a forest that had just stopped making forest sounds. I don't know, he said. The fog stayed on them for 4 more minutes. They sat in the dead car and watched the shapes move through the murk and did not breathe more than they had to. Then something changed. The quality of the air, the charge, the smell, and the fog began to pull back, not evaporate but retract, draw itself backward toward the north with the same deliberate quality it had arrived with, and as it thinned, the street reappeared. The shapes were gone. The intersection was visible again. The stoplight was dark and swinging slightly in a wind that hadn't been there before. We need to move, Marcus said. Agreed. Stay on the sidewalk, close to the buildings, not the middle of the street. I know how to move through a neighborhood. I know you do. They got out. The night was different now than it had been 10 minutes ago. Quieter. Not the quiet of late evening in a low traffic area, but the quiet of an environment from which certain sounds had been removed. No insects. No distant traffic. No voices from any direction. The city, which even in its most abandoned stretches always had some ambient sound. A TV somewhere. A siren far off, the collective mechanical hum of a million occupied spaces, was producing nothing. Marcus took a step, then another. Dia was beside him, matching his pace, and he could feel her reading the street the way she always read a space, watching the edges. They moved north on what he thought was Chalmers, though the street signs were gone. Not broken off, but removed, cleanly, the posts standing but empty of any indication of where they were. The buildings here were low and commercial, old storefronts with their windows either boarded or broken, one with a light still on inside that threw a thin yellow line across the sidewalk ahead of them. Marcus aimed for the light. Before they reached it, a door opened. A man stepped out. He was wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as belonging to the city in a very specific way. Work pants, a heavy flannel under an open canvas jacket, work boots that had seen years. He was older than Marcus by a decade and a half at least, silver at the temples, with the face of someone who had spent a long time calculating odds. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at them for 2 full seconds, with an expression that Marco recognized as the expression of someone who has just seen something unexpected in a bad situation and is deciding whether the unexpected thing is part of the bad situation or separate from it. "You come off a car," the man said. "How'd you know?" Marcus said. "Because nobody walks this stretch after dark unless their car quit on them. You're the third ones tonight." He stepped back from the doorway. "Get inside." The inside was a repair shop. Not operational, the bays were dark, and the lifts were down, and there was a layer of fine gray dust on everything that indicated months of disuse. But the structure was sound, and the windows that faced the street were blocked with hanging drop cloths, and the side door they'd come through was steel. There were cots set up along one wall, camping lanterns on the workbench, and on the 3 cots that were already occupied were 2 women and a young man who were awake and sitting up and watching them come in with attentive wariness of people who had learned in the past several hours to be careful. The older man's name was Calvin. He had been in his shop, which he did not own but maintained. The owner had been gone for 8 months, not moved away but gone, which was different. When the fog arrived 3 nights ago and had not left since, he had food, water, tools, and a working battery-powered radio that could not pick up any signal that made sense. He had 2 guns, a .357 and a 9mm, and he had come to the conclusion that they were not going to be sufficient. "What are they?" Dia said. Calvin sat on the edge of his workbench. He folded his hands. He said, "I don't know what they are. I know what they're doing." The word he used was not trafficking. The word he used was collecting. He said it the way someone says a word that they have chosen carefully, because the word that would come naturally is too large for the sentence it needs to fit into. They had collected 11 people from this district in the past 3 days. Calvin knew because he had watched from inside the shop through a gap in the drop cloths, and he had seen them work. They moved in the fog. They used the fog the way a hunter uses cover, the way a careful predator uses the space between visible things. They were not indiscriminate. They were not frenzied. They were organized, efficient, operating according to a system that implied preparation, that implied they had done this before, that implied this particular stretch of city had been chosen rather than stumbled upon. They took Mrs. Edmonds from the house across the street, said one of the women on the cots. She was perhaps 50, and she said this with a flatness that Marcus recognized as the flatness of shock that had already passed through its hot phase and come out the other side as something cooler and harder. "I saw them carry her out. She was still alive. She was awake. She was looking back at me through the window. She knew I was watching." "They're taking people alive," Marcus said. "That seems to be the preference," Calvin said. He said it with a dryness that was not humor but something close to it, the kind of understated acknowledgement of horror that functions as a coping mechanism for people who have looked at something terrible long enough to need a way to say it without the full weight of it landing every time. "My read is that whatever they're doing with people, they need them functional. Organ harvesting," Dia said. Every head in the room turned toward her. "I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "I've been thinking about what kind of operation takes that many live bodies in that short a window and needs them in usable condition. There are things the fog is doing that are consistent with, I don't want to say anesthesia exactly, but suppression. That sound it makes. The charge in the air. I think it's lowering whatever response in the subjects might cause damage to the things they want." The room sat with this. "That's a very clinical way to put it," Calvin said. "I work clinical, it helps me think." "What do they want from bodies?" asked the young man on the 3rd cot. He was maybe 22 skinny, wearing a hoodie with the name of a college Marcus didn't recognize. He had the specific expression of someone whose understanding of the world had been recently and fundamentally restructured, and was still in the process of filing the new information. Depends on who's asking, Dia said. But if I had to guess, based on what I've seen through these windows tonight, species that's adapted to a different biochemistry, running on something that Earth biology produces. Adenosine, specific proteins, neural tissue. She paused. There's something else. The way they moved, you saw it. The clicking. The structure of the movement. They're not in peak condition. They're working with something the way we work with a shortage. Hungry, Marcus said. More than hungry. Depleted. The way a transplant patient is depleted. Not starving in the conventional sense, but missing something fundamental that the body can't produce without the right components. Calvin said, very quietly, so we're a resource. To something, yes. The two other women had not spoken. Marcus looked at them now. The one who had spoken earlier, Mrs. Edmonds, watching through the window, was named Sheila and had been living above her sister's flower shop 4 blocks east when the fog came and the lights went out and she had run. The other one, younger 20-ish, was named Petra, and she hadn't said anything at all since Marcus and Dia arrived. And when Marcus looked at her, he noticed that she was watching the door with the kind of sustained attention that was not fear exactly, but was something that fear had evolved into over the past several hours, something more like mission. What did you see? He asked her. Petra looked at him. Then she looked at Dia. Then she said, there's a building, 3 blocks north of here, on the canal, the old processing plant. They're keeping people there. Silence. You went out, Dia said. I had to know if my brother, he was in the street when the fog came. He was right there and I couldn't. She stopped. Her hands were flat on her thighs, pressing down. I went to the edge of the fog. I didn't go in. But I could see the plant from there. There are lights in the upper windows. Moving lights, like handheld. And I could hear, through the sound they make underneath it, I could hear people. Another silence. A different quality to it than the one before. How many you figure they're holding? Calvin said. More than 10. Based on the lights, the distribution of them. How'd you get back without them taking you? Marcus asked. I moved in the shadow of the buildings, and I didn't make any sound, and I think they're not very good at close in. They're not built for close in. When they're in the fog, they're confident, but at the edges, where they'd need to come out into the light, there's a hesitation. Like the light affects them somehow. Maybe not blinds them, but alters the way they process space. They can't see well in visible light, Dia said. They're operating in the fog because the fog is their medium. That's a theory, Marcus said. I have a lot of theories right now. None of them are good. He looked at her. She looked back. They had been together 4 years, and they had been in difficult situations before, not like this, not remotely like this, but situations that required both of them to be simultaneously afraid and clear-headed and honest with each other about what they were capable of. And they had a shorthand for this moment, a way of looking at each other that said, I'm scared and I'm here and I need to know where you are. She was scared and she was here. Okay, he said. It was the same word she had said in the car when the phone had no signal. A recalibration. What he had was a tire iron, 4 other people he didn't know, a city he knew as well as his own breathing, and a woman who had spent 10 years in emergency medicine and who reads situations the way other people read rooms. For the exits, for the complications, for the thing nobody was saying, what he did not have was a plan. Yet, the radio Calvin had on the workbench wasn't completely silent. Between the static and the signal noise and the broken fragments of what might have been broadcast, there were sounds, not voices, not music, that Dia sat with for 15 minutes with her eyes closed. Then she opened her eyes and said, they're communicating. Through it. The radio frequencies are being used as a carrier medium for something else. I can't decode it, but I can tell there's a structure. Can you disrupt it? Calvin said, maybe. Not by decoding it. But if the fog is generated by a signal, if the medium they move in is created or maintained by some kind of broadcast, you cut the broadcast, you clear the fog, Marcus said. Possibly. Or you alter it in a way that causes them to lose spatial orientation. The way you jam a navigation signal. You don't need to destroy it, you just need to make it wrong. With what? Calvin looked at his workbench. At the tools arranged on the pegboard above it with the kind of comprehensive coverage of purpose that a serious mechanic keeps close. At the radio. At the various electrical components stacked in categorized bins along the wall. My nephew builds things, Calvin said. Electronics. Nothing special, just hobbyist stuff. But I have what he leaves here. What does he leave here? Calvin went to a steel cabinet at the back and opened it. Inside were the accumulated materials of someone's passion. Capacitors, resistors, breadboards, coils of copper wire, a frequency generator that looked hand-built, several small transmitter units of varying states of completion, a scope. The scope was what mattered. The scope told Dia what frequency the broadcast was operating on. She looked at Marcus. He said, I can rebuild an alternator while someone is revving the engine. I can do this. You're an automotive engineer. I'm whatever we need me to be tonight. The young man on the cot, whose name Marcus had not yet asked for, a failure he corrected now and was told, was Leon, turned out to have 2 years of electrical engineering coursework before circumstances had intervened, and his face, when he saw the components in the cabinet, changed from the restructured worldview expression to something more specific and more useful, which was the expression of someone who sees a problem with a shape they recognize. Signal modulation, Leon said. If we can modulate the carrier at a frequency that creates destructive interference in the reception range they're using, can you do it with what S here? Dia asked. I don't know. Maybe. He was already at the cabinet pulling components, holding them up, putting them back. I need 20 minutes. You have 15, Calvin said, and went to check the door. The fog outside was doing what it had been doing since the beginning, sitting, pressing, waiting. Marcus watched it through the edge of the drop cloth for 3 full minutes and tried to catalog what he knew. The shapes moved in it, but did not appear to maintain constant presence at any specific location. They patrolled, if that was the word, in routes that were not random but were spaced. He had not seen more than 2 shapes in the same block at the same time. The closest they had come to the shop was 30 feet, and both times they had turned before reaching it, as if the shop registered differently, as if the smell of old oil and metal composite was confusing the signal or the scent or whatever sense they were using to locate people in the fog. Petra came and stood beside him. Tell me about the plant, he said. She told him. It had been a water processing facility, decommissioned in 2031 when the new treatment infrastructure had gone in south of the city. 4 stories. Canal on the east side, loading dock on the south, maintenance access on the west that was below grade, down a concrete ramp into a space that would have been used for equipment, but was currently, based on what she'd seen, not actively monitored. The active lights were on the upper floors. You said they hesitate at the edge of the fog. Yes. So they're not patrolling between the fog and the plant. They're inside. When I watched, they went in and didn't come out for longer than it took to. She stopped. For longer than it would take to make a transit. Okay. If Leon's thing works and the fog drops or shifts, there's a window. A small one. Small is okay. Small is workable. He turned to her fully. Can you get us to the west access without moving through the open? Her expression said she had already been thinking about this. She was the one who had gone out, who had mapped the space with her own body and her own nerve, and Marcus recognized something in her face that he recognized in himself and in Dia, which was the look of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and is simply waiting for the logistics to be ready. Yes, she said. Leon's device took 19 minutes. It was ugly. Components soldered to a cut piece of circuit board, wrapped in electrical tape, wired to the frequency generator and the small transmitter, and it looked nothing like anything Marcus had ever seen in a professional context, but when Leon powered it up, and the scope showed the interference pattern Dia was looking for, she nodded with the specific nod of someone who has just verified a calculation. How long will it hold? Marcus asked. Until the battery dies or they adjust, Leon said. The second one's more concerning. If they can adapt the carrier frequency in real time, how long before they could do that? I have no idea what they're working with. If it's adaptive, minutes. If it's fixed, maybe as long as we need. We go on minutes, Dia said. We plan for minutes. Calvin handed Marcus the 357 without preamble. He kept the 9mm. If Marcus looked at it for a moment, he'd fired guns before, not often, not with expertise, and then put it in his waistband and stopped thinking about whether he was the right person to have it, and started thinking about how to use it. Shayla said, You stay. You watch the shop. If anything comes inside the shop, you. I know what I do if something comes inside the shop, Sheila said. She had found a wrench on the workbench and was holding it with the comfort of someone who had been keeping herself safe with whatever was available since long before tonight. They went out through the side door in pairs, Petra first with Marcus, then Dea with Leon and Calvin behind, and the street was different. The fog had not dropped. The device was not a fog disperser. It was a signal jammer, and fog didn't work on radio signals. But something in the quality of it had changed. Something in the charged undercurrent had gone wrong, and the shapes that had been moving through it were not moving, were still. Were stationary in positions that suggested disorientation the way a person stops moving when the floor does something unexpected, when the vestibular system gets bad data and the body halts to reprocess. It worked, Leon breathed. Move, Marcus said. Petra moved. She knew the route and she moved it with the efficient grace of someone navigating familiar space in the dark, which was exactly what she was doing. This was her part of the city. These were streets she had walked since childhood, and whatever the fog had done to the geography of the night, it had not unmade her knowledge of where the walls were and where the gaps were, and how to use the space between buildings as cover. They went 3 blocks north in 4 minutes. The shapes in the fog did not pursue them. Several pivoted as they passed, the heads, or what functioned as heads, tracking in their direction, but the tracking was vague, uncertain, like trying to read a text in a language that is almost, but not quite your own. The interference was doing something to their navigation, not blinding them, blurring them. The processing plant was exactly where Petra had said it was. It was bigger than Marcus had expected. 3 times the footprint of the buildings they'd been moving between, and the upper windows showed the moving lights she'd described, a systematic back and forth that suggested active operation inside. The maintenance ramp was on the west side, and it was dark, and the gate at the top of it was locked with a padlock that Calvin looked at once and then hit twice with the butt of the 9mm until it gave. They went down. The below-grade level was equipment storage, as Petra had said, and it was empty of everything except empty storage racks and old dust, and a smell that was not the smell of the street, not that strange charge, but something else, something metabolic and warm and wrong in a way that made Marcus's body want to go in the other direction. He stopped himself from going in the other direction. He put one hand against the wall and breathed through his mouth and made himself catalog what the smell was telling him. Medical, Dia said quietly from just behind him. She'd smelled it too. Biological processes. They're running something up there. How high up? 3rd or 4th floor, based on how dilute it is down here. There was a stairwell at the east end of the storage level. Metal stairs, industrial, the kind with open grating you could see through to the levels below. They went up 1 flight, 2 flights, paused at each landing to listen. On the 2nd floor, they heard the clicking, the wet, mechanical sound from the fog, but concentrated, multiplied, coming from multiple sources. They did not open the 2nd floor door. They went past it. The 3rd floor, Marcus had his hand on the door handle when Dia put hers over his. She looked at him. He looked at her. She shook her head once, not don't go in, but wait, and put her ear to the door. He waited. Leon was behind him, breathing carefully. Calvin was on the landing below, watching the stairwell they'd come up, the 9mm ready. Dia stepped back. She held up 4 fingers, then pointed at the door, then drew a rough square with her hands, 4 of them, distributed in the space behind the door. Then she held up both hands, fingers spread, 10 or more of something else. Marcus thought for a moment. Then he held up the tire iron, looked at Leon, and gestured. When I go, you go for the nearest one. Leon nodded. He had found a length of steel pipe somewhere in the storage level and was holding it like a man who had decided to hold it. The door opened inward. Marcus pushed it fast, low, using his shoulder, and came through moving. The 3rd floor was a factory floor, long and open, with support columns spaced at regular intervals, and the old overhead crane tracks still running the length of the ceiling. The creatures were there, 7 of them, not 4, moving between rows of structures that Marcus's brain tried to categorize and kept failing at. The structures were roughly coffin-sized. They were arranged in rows of 6. There were people in them. He saw this in the first half-second. The people in the structures were conscious, some of them, most of them, lying flat, aware, some moving their heads to look at the sudden noise and light from the door. They were being held not by physical restraints, but by something else, something the fog was doing, the same anesthetic suppressive quality that Dia had identified. Their expressions were not drugged blank, but rather the expressions of people who are awake and trying very hard to operate bodies that are not quite responding the way they should. Mrs. Edmonds, Marcus thought. That's who we came for. The creatures turned. 7 of them. And now that he was close, not 30 feet away in yellow fog, but 10 feet 8-5, he could see them fully, could see the architecture of them, the way the body was organized around a different set of priorities than a human body, wider at the middle and narrowing at the extremities, the head proportionally small and positioned low on the body structure, the eyes, if they were eyes, facing forward and multifaceted and catching the moving light from the handheld sources they carried in what served as hands. They were tall. He had thought 7 feet from the fog. He now thought 9. The clicking sound came from a structure in the chest region, not a mouth, not a throat, but something mechanical and biological combined, and the sound modulated as he watched shifted and he understood that it was communication, that the seven of them were processing the intrusion and conferring about what to do about it. They had not moved yet. This was the hesitation. This was what Petra had seen at the edge of the fog. At close range, in direct visible light, they processed slower. The information was right. He was right there. There were humans right there. The intrusion was real. But the processing of that information into action was taking longer than it should have. Marcus crossed the floor in 3 seconds and hit the nearest creature with the tire iron. What happened next he would not fully be able to account for afterward. He would know some things, that the tire iron connected, that it connected hard, that the creature made a sound that was different from the clicking, higher, aperiodic, the sound of something in pain or alarm, and staggered. He would know that Dea had come through the door behind him and gone directly for the nearest coffin structure and had her hands on the latching mechanism before any of the creatures reached her. He would know that Leon had connected with his length of pipe on the side of another creature and had found, through either luck or the instinct of someone whose body understands structural failure, the place where the chest structure was thinnest, and had followed through, and the creature had dropped. He would know that 2 of them had gotten around him and were moving toward the occupied structures and toward Dia, that he had turned and interposed himself, both hands on the tire iron, and planted his feet on the factory floor of a building that had once processed water for a city of hundreds of thousands, and had said, in a voice that did not sound like his own voice, but was, distinctly, undeniably his, "You don't want to." He would know that they had stopped, not because the words meant anything to them, not because they understood English or had any framework for the warning, but because the body said it. The set of the feet, the angle of the arms, the specific configuration of a human being who has decided to occupy a piece of ground and will not be moved from it. This configuration communicated something that crossed whatever gap existed between his biology and theirs. It communicated, this is a fixed point. This is something that will cost. And they had learned, in whatever calculations they were running about the relative worth of different actions, to pay attention to cost. Dia got the first structure open. The woman inside was Mrs. Edmonds, and she came upright with the mechanical effort of someone whose muscles had been partially suppressed for hours, and the first thing she said, looking at Marcus standing between her and the creatures with a tire iron, was, "Boy, took you long enough. They got 11 people out of that floor." 2 of the creatures pursued them to the top of the stairs and then did not follow them down. Whether because the below-grade darkness was confusing, or because the jamming device was still doing its work, or because they had made a calculations about the efficiency of pursuit, Marcus didn't know and didn't stop to investigate. The fog was still present but thinner. The interference had done what Leon had predicted, altered the signal in a way the system behind it had not been built to compensate for quickly, and the fog was losing the quality of deliberateness, was becoming more ordinary, more dispersed, more something that could be walked through without the sense of being inside a predator's range. They moved south through it toward the lights. The lights turned out to be police. Not the police of the ordinary city, patrol cars with lights and officers calling through windows, but police who had been there for hours and had not come into the affected zone and had set up a perimeter and were standing at its edges, with expressions that Marcus read as the expressions of people who understood that something was happening inside the perimeter that they did not have a framework for and were unwilling to step into. Officer J. Peterson was the one who came forward when the group emerged from the fog. He was a 20-year veteran, and he had the face of a man who has trained himself to maintain operational calm through familiarity with worst-case scenarios. But he was having trouble with his face right now, and Marcus felt a specific and complicated kind of anger at the sight of him at the perimeter, at the hours of not going in that he set aside for the moment because the moment required other things. How many are still inside? Peterson said. We got 11 out. We saw more structures in the room we didn't open, Dia said. 3rd floor. There are at least 7 of them, the other things, and potentially more on other floors. What kind of weapons? They don't use weapons. They use the environment, the fog. She looked at him steadily. Your weapons won't do what you expect them to do if you go in while the fog is up. The fog is, it's fog. No, Marcus said, it isn't. He told Peterson what he knew. He told him quickly and with the compressed clarity of someone who has processed a situation thoroughly under conditions that require compressed clarity. The signal, the medium, the organized nature of the operation, these were not random phenomena. This was a system, and the system had a source. There's something running the signal, Marcus said. Somewhere in the district, something that's broadcasting. Leon's device is jamming, but it's a bandage, it's not a cut. You find the source, you shut it down, the fog drops, and they're operating in a medium they're not adapted for. And how do I find the source? You've had people with radio equipment on the perimeter for hours. Use them to triangulate the carrier. My read is it's north of the canal. The shapes were all moving northeast toward the river, something in the old industrial zone. Peterson looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You just came out of that." "Yes." "With 11 people." "Yes." "How?" Marcus looked at him. He looked at Dia, who was already with the people they'd brought out, was moving among them with the practiced assessment of a trauma nurse who has just walked out of something terrible and is not done yet. He looked at Leon, who was sitting on the ground with the jerry-rigged jammer in his hands, looking at it with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and satisfaction. He looked at Calvin, who was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and looking at nothing in particular, which was the way Calvin looked at things that required being processed at a certain remove before they could be looked at directly. "We went in," Marcus said. "That's how." Peterson held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned and started giving instructions to the officers behind him. The source turned out to be in the basement of a former chemical processing facility 400 meters north of the canal. It was not technology that any of the specialists called to the scene that night, or in the days that followed could fully categorize, but it was technology, machinery, structured, purposeful, and it was operating on a power source that was also not immediately categorizable and also not, ultimately, indestructible. The Army Corps of Engineers team that reached it at 4 in the morning found it had already been partially disabled by what one of the engineers described as significant mechanical trauma consistent with a blunt instrument, and when they traced the damage, they found boot prints in the dust on the basement floor. 2 people's boot prints, a larger and a smaller, moving together, moving fast. The fog lifted at 4:17 a.m. The processing plant gave up 43 people alive when the ground teams went in after. The fog dropped, and the creatures that had been operating the facility were gone. Not fleeing through the city, not captured, simply gone, as if the fog had been both their medium and their vehicle, and its absence had taken them back to wherever they'd come from. Whether they had left or left for now was a question nobody could answer with confidence, and Marcus, sitting in the back of an ambulance with a blanket that he didn't need around his shoulders and a cup of coffee that he absolutely did, looked north toward the river and thought about the shapes in the fog and the way they had moved with purpose, with organization, with the bearing of something operating according to a plan. Plans had next steps. Plans had contingencies. Plans had, somewhere, a version of this outcome factored in. Not this specific outcome. Not these specific 2 people with a tire iron and a frequency jammer and 11 extracted civilians. Not the precise form this particular disruption to their operation had taken, but some version of resistance, some scenario in which the resources declined to be resources. He thought about the way the 2 creatures at the top of the stairwell had stopped. Not retreated. Stopped, held, calculated. Whatever they were running, it was the kind of operation that involved calculation. And something that calculates can be made to calculate differently, can be made to factor in a cost that it hadn't previously factored, can be disrupted. Not destroyed, not ended, not once and for all and permanently, because that wasn't the shape of how things like this went. He understood that, but disrupted, made to stall, made to reconsider, made to carry the knowledge forward that this particular planet, this particular species, had a habit of going back in when it probably shouldn't, and finding a way to bring people home. Dia appeared at the ambulance door. She was wearing someone's borrowed jacket and had a smear of something on her left cheek that might have been concrete dust or might have been the result of a very close encounter with the creature that had gotten around Marcus on the factory floor. He hadn't seen exactly what had happened there, and she hadn't told him yet. Her eyes were tired in the specific way of someone who had been fully alert for a long time and was only now allowing the fatigue to surface. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Mrs. Edmonds wants to know if we need anything," she said. "Does she have more coffee?" "She's coordinating the volunteers," Dia said. "So probably yes." He almost smiled. She got into the ambulance and sat next to him, and he put the blanket around both of them, and they sat and looked north at the sky that was beginning, on its eastern edge, to lighten. The fog was gone, and the city was making sounds again. Distant traffic, a dog, the municipal generators that had come back online, and it smelled like a city again, like concrete and river and the collective breath of all the occupied spaces. And Marcus drank his coffee and thought about the car. The car was still 3 blocks south, dead on Chalmers, with the jumper cables in the trunk he'd never used. and his uncle's tire iron somewhere on the third floor of the processing plant. He'd set it down when they were moving the last of the occupied structures, and in the press of getting peaceful to the stairs, he hadn't thought to pick it back up. He thought about going back for it. He thought it was probably not retrievable. He thought his uncle would have understood, would have said that the point of the tool was what you could do with it, and that once it had done what it was going to do, the object itself didn't matter. What he had done with it mattered. What they had done with a tire iron and a frequency jammer and 4 people in a repair shop and a route through the dark that a young woman had memorized with her feet mattered. Not enough to matter in the largest sense. Not enough to have resolved anything, to have closed the file, to have sent whatever was operating in the fog back to wherever it had come from, and guaranteed it would not come back. He knew this with the clear-eyed lack of comfort that came from being a person who saw situations as they were, rather than as he wished them to be. But enough. Enough to have put 43 people back on the street who would not otherwise have been there. Enough to have sent something, a message written in the only language that actually translates across any gap. The language of consequence. We are here. We notice, we respond, we go back in. Whatever you are calculating, calculate that. Leon appeared at the ambulance, the jammer in one hand, his phone in the other. The phones were working again. The signal had come back with the fog's departure, or perhaps because of it. And he was looking at something on the screen, with the expression of someone who has just received information that is a lot and a little at the same time. There are reports, he said, from other cities. Detroit's not the place this happened tonight. Marcus waited. Milwaukee, Cleveland, Buffalo, Toledo, Leon looked up. All Great Lakes cities, all the same window, 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. All the same fog signature. How many people taken? Unknown. Still coming in. He looked at the jammer in his hand. But the interference worked. In Detroit it worked. Because of what you built, Dia said. Because of what we all did, Leon said. He sat down on the ambulance bumper. He looked at the jammer for a long moment. Then he said, more quietly, I'm going to rebuild this better. Portable, smaller. He looked at Marcus. And I need someone to teach me how to use a tire iron. Marcus regarded him. It's not complicated, he said. You just don't stop. Leon nodded as if this were a technical specification, as if he were filing it. The sun was beginning to color the eastern sky a particular shade of orange that Marcus associated with autumn mornings in Detroit. The kind of orange that felt earned, that came after the cold clarity of the night, and said something about persistence and the willingness of the light to come back. He watched it come, somewhere to the north, beyond the canal, and the old chemical plant and whatever was left of the machinery that had tried to make this city into a larder. The river ran east toward the lake the way it had always run, carrying whatever the night had left in it, carrying it forward. The car was going to need a jump, or a tow, or possibly a full diagnosis of whatever the fog had done to its electrical system, which was going to be an interesting conversation with the mechanic. He finished his coffee. He was going to need more coffee. He stood up from the ambulance and looked at the city around him. The buildings coming clear in the early light, the officers working the perimeter, the 43 people in blankets sitting on curbs and in the backs of vehicles and being attended to by paramedics who had been there all night, and by Dia, who was also there, still, always. And he felt something that was not triumph and was not relief and was not the absence of fear, because the fear was still present entirely. It had never left. It had simply been standing aside to make room for the other things. What he felt was the particular and specific satisfaction of a person who has been in a situation that required everything they had, who gave everything they had, and who is standing on the other side of it still standing. 43 people who were home. 1 tire iron, somewhere in the wreckage. A frequency that could be jammed. A city that, despite everything, was still making sound. He looked at Dia. She was writing something on a notepad. Assessment notes, vital signs, the things a nurse writes down, because writing things down is how you keep the work from becoming chaos. And she was doing it with the same focused attention she gave everything, the same quiet and absolute presence. And he thought, this is what we are. This is what the thing in the fog does not understand and cannot model and cannot harvest, because it isn't in any tissue, isn't any organ, isn't in anything that can be extracted and used and transferred to something that doesn't already have it. This. The specific human act of writing things down on a notepad at 5 in the morning after a night like this, because the work is still happening and the work matters. He put the coffee cup in the ambulance and went to help. The fog did not return to Detroit that winter. In the spring, there were new reports, different cities, different latitudes, and Leon's rebuilt device was in 6 places by then, and Dia, was training medical workers in 3 cities in what she'd learned on the 3rd floor of the processing plant, and the tire iron had a replacement in every car Marcus had driven since, and Mrs. Edmonds, who had gone back to the house across the street from Calvin's shop and had declined to discuss what had happened on the 3rd floor with anyone but, had been seen on more than one occasion, sitting at her window in the evenings and watching the street with the calm and steady attention of someone who knows that the thing she is watching for is real and who has decided that knowing is better than not knowing. Watching, not waiting. There is a difference. Marcus had learned that from Dia the first night in the car before the fog came in. He carried it the same way he carried the tire iron, because you were never in a position you couldn't improve with the right tool in your hand, and the tools that mattered in the end were not metal. They were the ones you carried in the part of you that looked at something impossible and said, okay, and meant it. Peterson was not a small man, and he was not a man who admitted uncertainty easily. Marcus had assessed this within 30 seconds of the first conversation. He was the kind of person who had built a professional identity around knowing what to do, around the institution of knowing what to do, around the hierarchy and the protocol and the chain that passed decisions upward and received orders back down, and that system was one he'd navigated for 2 decades, and it worked almost all the time because most situations had a category, had a precedent, had something in the manual that approximated what you were dealing with. This did not. Marcus was not angry at Peterson for the perimeter. He understood the perimeter. He had, in the ambulance, in the early part of the evening, when the fog was worst and the sounds from inside it were clearest, sat with the abstract question of whether, if their positions had been reversed, if he had been on the outside with authority and resources and no clear picture of what was inside, he would have done differently. He was honest with himself about the answer, which was probably not. Probably he would have held. Probably the cost calculus of sensing officers into an unknown, with no reliable intelligence and no framework for what the opposition was or what it could do, would have led him to the same perimeter, the same weight, but 43 people. But 11 hours of not going in. He didn't say this to Peterson. He thought it was important that he say it at some point, in some context, to someone with the ability to change the calculus next time. Not as an accusation, as information. The way Dia made notes on the notepad, because the work wasn't done yet and the information mattered. He said, the thing that worked was the frequency interference. That's the piece you build on. Peterson was writing in his own notebook. He was a man who wrote things down. Marcus respected that. Leon can replicate the device, Marcus continued. He said an hour. He probably means 2, but with better components, not a repair shop floor's worth. It could be smaller, more stable, and broadcastable at a larger radius. If you can get the right people on it, what kind of people? RF engineers. The kind who know how to listen to a signal before they try to talk over it. What Dia did with the scope and the radio, she spent 15 minutes and got a picture. That's the first step. Listen before you jam. Understand the architecture of the signal before you try to disrupt it. And you know this because I know what a good mechanic does before they fix something that's broken. You don't reach for the wrench first. You listen to the engine. Peterson wrote something down. Marcus couldn't see what. You said they responded to you holding ground, Peterson said. At the stairs. They stopped calculating and started recalculating. The physical configuration meant something. Not words, not the gun, the configuration. The decision to occupy that space and make it cost. Can't teach that in a briefing. No, you can teach people to stand their ground. You can't teach them to mean it. But, he paused, thinking about how to put it. The thing I want you to understand is that they're not adapted for that. For someone who means it and knows the space. They're adapted for taking people who are disoriented, who are stumbling around in the fog without any read on the environment. The advantage was ours, the moment we understood what the fog was doing and countered it. Before that, we were on their ground. After, we were on ours. So the countermeasure is information. The countermeasure is always information. That's the countermeasure for everything. Peterson looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, what's your job, your actual job? Automotive systems engineer. Why? Because you think in a particular way. My father was a diagnostician. He fixed things that nobody else could figure out. He used to say, the system is always telling you what's wrong. Your job is just to listen. He stopped talking about that. His father had been gone for 11 years, and he didn't talk about him often, and this was not the moment. But the voice was there, running underneath everything the way a ground frequency runs under a signal, always present, only sometimes audible, and the times you could hear it were the times you needed it most. The sun was fully up, By the time Marcus and Dia got back to the car, it was sitting exactly where they'd left it, which was both unsurprising and slightly strange. Everything about the night had the quality of something that should have changed the physical world more visibly than it had. The car was dead. The street was quiet. There was fine gray dust along the tops of the window seals that had not been there before, and when Marcus crouched and looked at the undercarriage, he found that the wiring harness on the driver's side showed signs of, he'd call it, oxidation, because he didn't have another word for it, a kind of rapid aging of the insulation material that should not have happened in a vehicle that was less than a year old. The fog had done this. Whatever the fog was carrying, charge, chemistry, biology, all three, it had done this to the car's electronics the same way, he thought. It had done something to the people it surrounded, a suppression, a systematic interference with function. The car had been rendered inoperable not through any single dramatic event, but through the same distributed assault the people in the processing plant had experienced, applied at a different scale to a different kind of system. Systems, he thought. It thinks in systems. That was important. That was a thing to know. Can you fix it? Dia said. Not here. I need the shop. He stood up. But I know what's wrong. Is that different from being able to fix it? It's the first part of it. He looked at her. Are you okay? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was to say she actually thought about it, rather than reflexively answering. I will be, she said. I need to sleep for approximately 9 years and eat something, and I have things that I'm going to need to process at some point about what I saw up there, what was happening to those people, what they were doing. She paused. The biochemistry of it. I was right, wasn't I? The suppression, the extraction focus. Your read was right. I didn't want to be right about that. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, there's something else. When I was going from structure to structure, getting people out, one of the creatures, got very close to me. I mean, very close. Arm's length. She looked at her right hand. I had my hands on the latch, and it was right there, and I didn't have anything. You were across the room. He waited. It didn't take me, she said. It had the chance, and it paused, the same way they paused at the stairs, and I looked up at it. She stopped. I looked up at it, and I was thinking about, it's stupid. I was thinking about Mrs. Edmonds, about getting her out first, because she'd been there longest. And then I looked at the creature, and I said out loud, I'm not done yet. Like I was talking to a person, like I was giving it information that it might use. Did it move? It moved away. It went back toward the middle of the floor. She shook her head. I don't know if that's what made the difference. I don't know if it was the words or the tone or just that it had something more efficient to do than take me at that moment. But I said it. I'm not done yet. Yeah, he looked at her. The morning light was coming from the east, and it was in her face, and she looked like she had been through something, not broken by it, not diminished by it, but changed in the specific way that people are changed when they have found out what they're made of under conditions they didn't choose. It was not a comfortable look. It was an honest one. Not done yet, he said. No, she said. I'm really not. They got a tow. They got breakfast. They went home to their apartment on the 6th floor of a building in Midtown with a view of the river to the east and slept until 2 in the afternoon. And when they woke up, there were 47 missed calls between their two. Phones in the news cycle had found a shape for what had happened. A complicated, contested, official denial and scientific shape that managed to be simultaneously everywhere and uninformative. And there were 3 messages from Leon, 2 from Peterson, 1 from a researcher at the University of Michigan, whose area of study Marcus read twice before understanding that she had been studying atmospheric anomalies over the Great Lakes for 6 years and had a theory that was going to require a very long conversation. Marcus made coffee, real coffee, in the real kitchen in the apartment that smelled like their lives. Books and the particular hand soap Dia, preferred and motor oil that he never quite got out of the cracks in his hands no matter how many times he washed them. He made 2 cups and brought one to Dia, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her notepad open, writing. She was always writing. When he had first met her, he had thought it was journaling, and she had clarified that it was less introspective than that. It was more like keeping a log, she'd said, the way a ship keeps a log, because the ship doesn't know what's going to matter later, and so it writes everything down. He sat across from her and drank his coffee and watched her write. What are you putting down? He said. Everything I observed about the suppression mechanism, the physical symptoms in the subjects, the sequence of recovery after removal from the affected zone, the specific characteristics of the click sound, and what I think it's doing neurologically. She wrote a sentence without looking up. I want to build a response protocol. Something a first responder can use without having an electrical engineering background or a mechanic's intuition. That's a project, yes. She looked up. It's a project I'm going to do. Her eyes were steady. Because what happened last night, it's not done. You know that. I know that. So there has to be a protocol. There has to be a thing that people can learn, because the next time, she paused. There will be a next time, and the time after that, and the thing that will determine how those go is whether we've built anything with what we learned last night, or whether we went home and waited for someone else to build it. He thought about this. He thought about his father, about listening to the engine. What do you need from me? He said. She looked at the notepad. Then she said, tell me everything you saw. Start from when the car stopped making sense. Don't edit it. Don't decide what's important. I'll decide what's important. Just tell me everything, in order as you experienced it. So he did. He talked for an hour and 40 minutes. She wrote everything down. When he got to the part about his uncle and the tire iron and the weight of it in his hand and how that specific physical fact, the weight of it, the solidity of it, the handle worn smooth in one spot from years of sitting in the trunk, had been the thing that made the rest of it possible, she stopped writing and looked at him. The tire iron, she said. Yeah, not just as a weapon. Not really as a weapon at all. As, I don't know, as an anchor, as the thing that told my body it had something to do, that there was an action possible even if I hadn't figured out what the action was yet. She wrote this down. My uncle would have found that funny, Marcus said. That the point of carrying it was so that your body would believe you could do something. No, Dia said. That's not funny. That's the entire thing. That's the mechanism. She underlined something. The suppression works by inducing a belief state, not just a physical state. The fog isn't only chemistry. It's also a communication. It's saying, you can't act. You're already done. You're a resource, not an agent. And the tire iron said different. The tire iron said different. She wrote for another 30 seconds. Then she looked up and said, I'm going to call that out in the protocol. As a principle. Not as carry a tire iron, as give your body evidence that you have capacity for action. It can be anything. It can be keys. It can be knowing which way is north. It can be a name you're trying to get back to. Give your body evidence. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with the coffee and the morning light, and the notepad full of things that might matter very much to people he hadn't met yet, and he thought, yes, that is exactly the thing. That is the shape of how you survive something that doesn't think you're an agent. You give your body evidence, you hold something, you say a name, you tell the thing at arm's length, I'm not done, and then you are not done. The University of Michigan researcher's name was Dr. Amara O.C., and she had been studying anomalous electromagnetic readings in the Great Lakes Basin since 2027, when the first of the events, smaller events, subtler, events that had been categorized as unusual weather and unusual equipment behavior and unusual wildlife migration patterns, and had never been assembled into a single picture, had begun. She drove to Detroit the following day and sat at Marcus and Dia's kitchen table for 4 hours. She had the same quality they had recognized in Leon. The quality of someone whose framework for understanding the world has been forcibly expanded by evidence and who has responded to this expansion by becoming more rigorous, not less. She listened more than she talked, and when she talked, she asked precise questions, and at the end of the 4 hours, she looked at the notes and the device Leon had brought and the readouts from the scope Calvin had lent them, and she said, you found the frequency. Dia found the frequency, Marcus said. The frequency is, she looked at her own notes, this is not a natural phenomenon. This is not even a technology we have a parallel for, exactly. But the structure of it is a structure I recognize, because I've been looking at the edges of it for 6 years, and the edges of it are, they're a pattern, they're consistent. They're consistent across the dates and the locations, in a way that means whoever is doing this is working from a repeatable playbook. Which means it can be learned, Dia said. Which means it can be anticipated, O.C. said. Which is even better. She looked at the jammer. Your version works. I want to build a version that works before the fog arrives, a passive detection system that reads for the carrier signal at low amplitude and alerts before the fog develops. Warning. Time to prepare. Time to carry the tire iron, Marcus said. Ose looked at him, a small, precise smile. Yes, she said. Time to carry the tire iron. The protocol took 2 months to write. Dia wrote most of it. O.C. wrote the technical sections. Leon wrote the device specifications and built 12 versions in his cousin's garage in Hamtramck, each one smaller and more stable than the last. Marcus wrote the section on environmental navigation, how to move through an affected zone, how to read the shapes in the fog by their motion patterns, how to identify the points of hesitation and use them, and he wrote it the way his Father had taught him to explain a diagnosis. Start with what you hear, work toward what you know, never tell someone what's wrong before you've told them what they already understand. The protocol was 42 pages. It was not classified. It was not published through any official channel. It was emailed and shared and passed between people who had been in affected zones in 8 cities, and it was copied and printed and folded into jacket pockets and put in the glove compartments of cars, and in the spring when the next fog event came, not to Detroit, but to Cleveland, at a Tuesday at 11 p.m. in the warehouse district on the lakefront. 2 people had the protocol and a device and had already identified the frequency, and they went in. They brought back 17 people. The time after that, a cell of 4 people in Milwaukee went in and brought back 22. The time after that, 6 weeks later in Buffalo, there was a detection alert 2 hours before the fog formed, and the zone was pre-cleared, and no one was taken. No one was taken. Marcus heard about this from OC by text at 6 in the morning, and he sat up in bed and read the message. Twice, he did not wake Dea. He sat with it in the quiet of the bedroom, and he thought about Mrs. Edmonds at her window, watching, about Petra and the route she'd memorized with her feet, about Leon on the garage floor in Hamtramck with solder and wire and the specific satisfaction of solving a problem that had a shape he recognized. He thought about the way the 2 creatures at the top of the stairs had stopped. He thought, they are still calculating. He thought, let them calculate. Because what they were calculating now was different than what they'd calculated before. They'd run the numbers on a species that would sit in closed rooms, while people were taken from the streets outside, on a species that would establish perimeters and wait, on a species that offered itself up to suppression because it didn't understand that the suppression was a message rather than a fact. They were revising those numbers. They were finding, in the data they were collecting, because they were data-oriented, because the operation was systematic, because systems keep records, evidence that the calculation was wrong, that the resource was not passive, that the resource had a habit of going back in, of building protocols from single nights of experience, of listening to the signal before jamming it, of making devices in garages and sharing them by email and standing in the dark on factory floors and saying to things that should be terrifying, you don't want to. He thought about what Dia had said in the car, before any of it, before the fog, before the tire iron, before any of it. She had woken up and looked at the dark dashboard and said, in a tone of complete, unfazed practicality, we stopped. Not what happened, or oh no, or what are we going to do? Just, we stopped. An observation, a fact established, a baseline from which to proceed. They had stopped, and then they had not stayed stopped. He got up and made coffee. He looked out the east-facing window at the river. The river was running the way it always ran, eastward in the early gray light of a spring morning, and the city around it was making the sounds it made. Waking sounds, the first buses, someone's radio from an open window 3 floors below, and he stood with his coffee and listened to it. His father's voice, underneath the ambient sound of the waking city. The system is always telling you what's wrong. Your job is just to listen. He listened. The city was not wrong this morning. The city was present, occupied, awake, making all its sounds. The city was a system, and the system was running, and in it, in the apartments and the repair shops and the garages and the kitchen tables, were people who had listened, who had learned, who had built something from what they learned and shared it, and built more from what came back. 42 pages in jacket pockets, devices in glove compartments, no one taken in Buffalo. He finished his coffee. He went back to the bedroom and got back into bed, and Dea made a sound without waking up, the semi-conscious acknowledgement of someone who is too far into sleep to surface, but close enough to know that the person they want in the bed is back in it. And he lay in the gray morning and thought about the next version of the device, which Leon had described in a text 3 days ago as about the size of a thick paperback, 8-hour battery, auto-tunes to the carrier on detection, and thought about the delivery routes for the protocol, where it hadn't reached yet, who hadn't heard yet, which cities on the Great Lakes were still running on the old numbers. He thought about all of this with his eyes closed, in the particular productive half-sleep that feels like rest but is actually planning. And then he slept properly and dreamed about nothing, which was its own kind of good news. When he woke up, Dea was at the kitchen table again. She had a new notepad. She was writing. He made coffee. He made 2 cups. He brought her one without asking, and she took it without looking up. And he sat across from her, and he said, "What's next?" She told him. There was, she said, a pattern in the recovery data she'd been compiling from the 43 survivors and the send from subsequent events. The suppression mechanism left markers, biological markers, traces in the chemistry of what the fog did to the body. These markers were not permanent, and they were not harmful in themselves, but they were unique. And unique meant identifiable, and identifiable meant that a blood panel could tell you within 24 hours whether someone had been in an affected zone in the past week, even if they showed no symptoms, even if they didn't know. Why does that matter? Marcus said. Because some of the subjects reported not knowing they'd been inside, not having a gap in memory exactly, but having a night that didn't quite add up, a few hours they couldn't account for. She looked up. If people who've been in an affected zone don't know it, can't identify themselves as having been in one, they don't know to look for the markers. They don't know to report. They disappear from the data. How many? Based on the distribution, the gap between reported and estimated, I think between 20 and 30% are not in the record. He sat with this. So there's a screening test, he said. I can write the specifications for one, getting it into the medical system, getting labs to run it, getting clinicians to know to order it. That's not my department. He thought about who it was the department of. He thought about Dr. Osi and her 6 years of data and her precision in the way she had said, this is not a natural phenomenon. He thought about Peterson and his notebook. He thought about the 42 pages in jacket pockets, and who had those pockets and who didn't, and what it would take to reach the people who didn't. What else? He said. She turned the notepad so he could see what was on the page. It was not a list. It was a map, a rough hand-drawn map of the Great Lakes Basin, with markers at each event location and lines connecting them, and a pattern in the lines that he looked at for a long moment before he understood what it meant. They're systematic, she said, not random. There's a logic to the sequence, event locations, timing intervals, the specific sectors within each city that get targeted. It's an operation with a schedule. So if you know the schedule, you know where to be next. She put her finger on the map on a city he recognized. I think this is the next one, within 6 weeks. I think this specific district, this specific infrastructure sector, warehousing, industrial, low ambient light. Toledo, he said. Toledo, she said. He looked at the map. He looked at the lines. He looked at the way she had drawn it. Precise, careful, every marker placed with the specific attention of someone who has been compiling data for months and has finally found a shape in it that can be understood. We should call Ose, he said. I already did. She's driving up tomorrow. He nodded. He looked at the map for another moment, and then he looked at his hands, the particular hands of a man who has spent 15 years with engines, scarred across the knuckles, the motor oil that never fully left the skin, strong in the way that repetitive work makes hands strong. And he thought about the tire iron and what it had said to his body in the dark car on Chalmers Street and what his body had said back. You can act. You have capacity. There is an action possible. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. When do we leave for Toledo? He said. Dia looked up from the map. Her eyes were steady and clear and tired in the way that people who have been doing necessary work for a long time are tired, not depleted, just honest about the cost of it. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across the dark interior of the dead car, the first night, before any of it. The look that said, I'm scared and I'm here and I need to know where you are. He was here, she could see that. 5 weeks, she said. Gives us time to build 4 more devices. OC says she can get 2 RF engineers. Leon says he can train them in a weekend. And you? I'll write the extended protocol, the screening procedure, the recovery guide. She looked at the notepad. I'll write everything down. He smiled. A real one, small, the kind doesn't announce itself. Yeah, he said. You will. Outside the east-facing window, the river ran toward the lake, carrying the night's weather east, making room for the day. The city made its sounds. In a garage in Hamtramck, a young man was soldering components to a board, and the light on his scope was steady, reading a frequency that the city underneath didn't know it was broadcasting, and that something far away was listening for, and the device was nearly done, and it was smaller than the last one, and it would work. It would work because they had listened first, because they had stood on the factory floor and said, you don't want to, because they had meant it, because meaning it was the thing that translated. The devices went out, the protocols went out, the map on the kitchen table redrawn, refined, annotated with OC's data and Leon's frequency signatures, and the survivor accounts that Dia had been gathering for months, was not a finished picture. It was a working picture. It was the picture of something being understood in real time by people who were paying attention, who had decided that paying attention was the job, that the job didn't have an end date, that the end date was something you worked toward rather than waited for. In Toledo, they pre-cleared the zone. No one taken. In Cleveland, the second time, they brought back 31. In every city, the perimeter officers went in. Not all of them, but more of them, because the protocol said, here is what you will encounter Here is what it wants you to believe about yourself. Here is the physical evidence you carry that says something different. Because Peterson had talked to other Petersons in other departments, and the 42 pages had become 80 pages, and then 112. Because the system was being listened to, Marcus drove to the plant in Hamtramck one Tuesday evening and sat with Leon while he calibrated the 8th generation device, and Leon said, not looking up from the scope, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "The way you talk to them. At the stairs." "You don't want to." He adjusted something. The scope changed. "I've been thinking about whether that was true. Whether it was actually true that they didn't want to. Or whether I just needed to say it." "Right." Marcus thought about this. He thought about it honestly, the way his father had taught him to think about a diagnosis, without attachment to a particular answer, without preference for the answer that was easier or more comfortable. "Both," he said. "I think both were true." Leon looked up. "I needed to say it," Marcus said. "My body needed to hear it said, and I think they genuinely hesitated. I think the calculation changed. I think, whatever they're optimized for, it's not a target that's occupying a space and believes it can defend it. That's not the resource type they came for." And something in the way I was standing said, "This is not that type. This is the other kind. The kind that comes back, the kind that comes back." Like Leon was quiet for a moment. The scope made a small sound. Then he said, "I want to write that into the training. Not as a tactic, I don't know how to teach a tactic, but as a thing to know about yourself before you go in, that you're the kind that comes back." "Give your body evidence," Marcus said. Leon looked at him. "Dia said that. It's in the protocol." "Page 12, Leon said. "Yeah, I read it." He went back to the scope. "I just keep finding new ways it's true." Marcus watched him work. The garage was warm and smelled of solder and cold coffee and the accumulated particulate of a young man's serious work. And outside through the open door, the evening street was making its sounds. And somewhere on the river, a barge was passing. And the city was present and occupied. And for this particular night, whole. He thought about the car on Chalmers Street. About the way the engine had given that last convulsive shudder and gone quiet. About Dia sleeping through most of the drive, earbuds in, trusting the motion underneath her. He thought we stopped. And then he thought the rest of it. The part that was not the end of the sentence, but the whole sentence. We stopped. And we didn't stay stopped. And because we didn't stay stopped, 31 people in an ambulance bay in Cleveland were making calls to their families in the particular voice of someone who has been where they were not supposed to be and has come back from it and is still trying to believe the phone in their hand is real. And a researcher in Ann Arbor was building a detection system that would give cities 2 hours of warning. And a young man in a garage in Hamtramck was calibrating a device that fit in a jacket pocket. And a trauma nurse was writing a protocol that would tell people how to give their bodies evidence. And somewhere in the data that something far away was collecting, in the revisions to the calculations, in the updated projections for what could be expected from the resource, there was a new variable, an unmodeled one that did not have a clean name in whatever language they used for these things. The variable was, they go back in. The variable was, they listen before they jam. The variable was, they write it down. The variable was, they mean it. And the variable was growing. In 42 pages and 112, and in the training sessions, and the devices in glove compartments, and the blood panels that clinics in 3 cities were running quietly on the side, and in the kitchen table maps, and the scope readings, and the late-night calls between cities, and the small, steady work of understanding something that did not want to be understood. The variable was growing. Marcus picked up the new device. It was smaller than a paperback. It was lighter than the tire iron. It fit in his jacket pocket. He put it there. He said goodbye to Leon. He drove home through the city that was making its sounds in the spring evening, radio on, engine running well, lights all working, all systems nominal. He parked in front of the building. He went upstairs. He opened the door. Dia was at the kitchen table. She was writing. He made coffee. He made 2 cups. He brought her one, and she took it without looking up. And the notepad was open to a new page. And on it, she was writing everything down, starting from the beginning, starting from the place where the system had first told her what it was doing, and she was writing it so that anyone could read it, so that the next person who stopped in the middle of a deserted street with the fog coming in would have a place to start. He sat across from her. He drank his coffee. He watched her write. Outside, the river ran east, as it always had, carrying everything forward, making room for what came next.